Good morning and welcome. My name is Marie Connolly. I'm Professor and Head of Social Work here at the University of Melbourne. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. In a few minutes, I'm going to call on my colleague, Shawana Andrews, to do our Acknowledgement of Country. But before I do that, I'd just like to say that this workshop was so popular. We've got a waiting list of 50 people, and it just is an indicator, I think, of how important this topic is in practice. So today we're going to hear about important research. In the Department of Social Work, we have a deep commitment to undertaking research and informing practice around domestic and family violence. One of our research clusters, the Child, Youth and Family Research Cluster, undertakes research across the areas of violence toward women and children. And today we're going to hear from our Melbourne research team, who are going to update you on the ARC linkage program that we're a part of currently. Fathering challenges in the context of domestic violence, an area that is clearly at the heart of what we need to know. The knowledge is partial and the evidence of effectiveness is somewhat limited. But the aim of this project is to improve the parenting experiences of children whose fathers have used domestic and family violence. So the team here at Melbourne will be bringing together 3 program areas this morning. Firstly, men's behavioural change. Secondly, culturally specific programs for Indigenous men who've perpetrated family violence. And thirdly, fathering programs that address abuse. So that will take us through to lunch. And after lunch, I'm delighted to say we'll be hearing from Professor Daniel Saunders from the School of Social Work at the University of Michigan. Social work at Melbourne has a long and important collaboration with the University of Michigan. We often have visitors from there, and it's becoming very much an opportunity for us to share across international boundaries. Dan Saunders probably needs little introduction. His work is well known for its depth of scholarship. And today, he's going to talk about men who use violence against women after separation. Alternatively, what we see in that area is that men who use violence against women may misuse their contact with their children and misuse the legal system in trying to maintain contact and control over their ex-partners. That's not the case for all men, however. Alternatively, some abusive men appear to have a genuine, caring connection with their children, and this connection has the potential to motivate them for positive change. So Dan's presentation today is aimed at increasing understanding of variations among men who use violence against women in their parenting. Several avenues of engagement will be described by Dan, including fathering after violence and supervised access programs. He'll also look at some of program effectiveness in this important area of work. So it'll be a stimulating, I'm sure, day today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the results of this. So, Shawana, can I call you up to do Acknowledgement of Country?
Thank you, Mary. My name's Shawana Andrews. I'm a lecturer in Indigenous Health in the School of Health Sciences at Melbourne Uni. I'm a Trawulwai woman from northeastern Tasmania, a descendant of Manalagena of Trawuna. And as such, I'm a visitor to the land that we're on today. So, as most, if not all of us are here. So I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land upon which we stand today. In addition to that, I'd also like to acknowledge the remote communities in Western Australia, the aunties and uncles, the cousins, brothers and sisters who are living in those remote communities and who are at risk of being dispossessed of their cultural lands and currently experiencing the structural violence that many Indigenous communities have experienced. And whilst I don't want to start off on a negative note for today, I think it's an important reminder of the continuing colonisation that Indigenous communities experience, and also a reminder and an appropriate context for the work that we're about to discuss throughout today. So I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoy the day. Thank you.
It's fantastic to see such a good turnout and such a range of visitors on the day from a range of different organisations. Thank you for coming on time. That's great. I'm going to start by just giving you a little bit of you've had a bit of a setup for the day. I'm Kristen Deemer. I'm from the University of Melbourne, and I'm working on this ARC Linkage Grant as a Senior Research Fellow. I've got quite a few of the team members here in the room with me, so I'll introduce them a little bit as I explain a bit about the project. So I'm going to set the scene a little bit about the day, and then I'm going to talk more about the project itself and what we're trying to cover for those of you who are new to it. The morning session, we're going, which has probably been outlined already, an overview of the research and a background of we have a presentation with a little bit of background from the SAFER research project, give the update on the progress of where we are now, and then we'll workshop some questions that have evolved out of the research point where we're interviewing managers of programs. So that'll be the morning session. We'll have lunch break for about an hour, and then the afternoon session we'll have a presentation from Dan Saunders. That'll be the bulk of the early afternoon after lunch. We'll do a Q&A session, and then we'll finish up with a panel discussion to contextualize some of the information from throughout the day, and gives you lots of opportunities to ask questions or to raise points that you think need to be included in this discussion. I want to also acknowledge that there's a lot of different people in the room from lots of different sectors. We've got family violence, we've got men's violence programs, we've got Indigenous programs, parenting and fathering programs, general counsellors, academic researchers, government, not-for-profit, managers. So we've got many different viewpoints and many different terminology phrases around family violence or use of violence in the home, and lots of different perspectives that people are speaking. Some will be speaking from the children's perspective, some from the women's perspective, some from the men's, some from the Indigenous, some from cultural communities. And I just want to please ask everyone to be respectful of if someone uses a language that's not really comfortable in the setting you work in. I think this is part of the shared knowledge and learning of how is everybody engaging with these issues, and we'd like to have the freedom to speak in the room rather than closing people down because maybe the choice of terminology isn't what you might choose. So I'd just like to put that out there very early in the day. We're also this research project focuses on men's use of violence towards women within family and family-like relationships. This is usually, but not always, an intimate partner. So while there are lots of other forms of violence that go on within the family, this is what this research focuses primarily on men's use of violence in the family, predominantly towards women, and then how that impacts on children. Okay. So just reiterating a little bit what I've said, the project is not aiming for consensus. Different strands allow for different perspectives. And this is not a father's rights project either. It's a project to support responsive and reparative fathering, which may or may not involve access to children. The safety of women and children is a priority in this research project. That's first and foremost. We also need to acknowledge a cultural lens that should be incorporated into the broad consultation within Aboriginal and Islander strand. and it also say within the cultural diversity of the groups that when we're talking. Careful thought towards methodology is always incorporating a trauma lens as well. Now, why this is important and why we've had so much interest, apart from media, is that we do have a huge number of children who are affected by family violence. This data is a little bit old, but it's taken from the Victorian Family Violence Database, and between 2000 to 2010, that should be not 1010, more than 20,000 Victorian children were recorded as being present each year at a family violence incident by Victoria Police. So some of them will be the same children multiple times, but by and large, you've got 20,000 children being recorded as being present at a family violence incident by police. Over an 11-year period of family violence reform, we've seen growing recognition of the need to protect children from violence through the use of a family violence intervention order. And over this 12 years of data collected, the number of children with finalized intervention orders rose from being identified as part of it as recording practices from about 4,000 up to 20,000 on intervention order, being named on intervention orders. And then finally, in a little snapshot data piece with the specialist family courts in 2010, 2011, victims who are, or applicants for family violence intervention orders, over half of them reported having children in their care. So these are just the people that we see going through a justice system that we can actually count with their engagement. That's just, as most of us know, that's kind of the tip of the iceberg, the children being affected. Now, a lot of this has driven our interest in having the Fathering Challenges project. I'm not sure how that got in there. So a bit of the background. Our aims and intentions for the Fathering Challenges project, this is an ARC linkage grant. And what that means is we come together between academics and sector research. And we want to look at the area of fathering in the context of domestic and family violence, where knowledge is partial. We know very little about what goes on for children in the domestic and family violence arena. And the evidence of effectiveness is limited. It's very difficult to evaluate these programs and evaluate what's happening with children. So the ultimate aim of this project is to improve the parenting experiences for children whose fathers have used domestic or family violence. This is way too small to read, but it gives you an impression of the overview of the involvement of organizations on this linkage grant. In the top, we've got 3 universities: University of Melbourne, Curtin University, and University of South Australia. 3 state governments: Victoria, South Australia, and Western Australia. We've got non-government partner organizations: Relationships Australia, Centre Care, No to Violence, DVVIC, Anglicare, and Communicare. And then we've got, at the bottom, we've got 2 secretariats or centres who are umbrellaing other organizations, family violence or men's program agencies. So SNAKE, the Secretariat of National Aboriginal and Islander Childcare, is providing an umbrella organization for VACA, the Healing Foundation, Children's Protection Society, Relationships Australia, Victoria, and Nagala. And the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare is umbrellaing 9 Victorian community sector organizations: DVVIC, Berry Street, Child and Family Services Ballarat, Kildana and Anglicare Family Life, Bethany and Salvation Army, and Drummond Street Relationship Services. So I just want to acknowledge all the partnerships, the groups that came together to help us pull this research project 3-year program together, and also acknowledge NTV and Berry Street who helped bring this session together today. The research team in Victoria, Professor Kathy Humphreys is on a research program travel through Europe at the moment. Professor Kelsey Hegarty, who's working in GP practice today, couldn't be here. Shawana Andrews, who was up here a few minutes ago. Myself, Joni Smith, sitting down the front, she'll be presenting in a minute. David Gallant, who's down the back. And Katie Lamb, who's our PhD student on the project. This is the Victorian team. In South Australia, we have Associate Professor Leah Bromfield and Stuart McDougall as a research assistant. In Western Australia, we have Professor Donna Chung, Dr. Alan Campbell, Simi Chugani, and we've also got internationally Professor Nikki Stanley. So I'm sorry, that's just acknowledgements of everyone, but it's also to impress upon you about how important it is to get information and ideas from all different sectors across Australia and internationally. So, our 3 research questions for this project overall over 3 years. First of all, how do men's behavior change, or perpetrator programs, or men who use violence programs, whatever language you want to use, Aboriginal programs, and fathering programs? How do they address the issue of fathering in the context of family violence? Secondly, how and under what circumstances are fathers who use violence parenting? And thirdly, what are the key fathering issues that need to be addressed within men's behavior change, Aboriginal, and fathering programs? And some of this you're going to help us with today. It's an action research project, combined strategy for inquiry and developing the practice action together in association with those who are providing the service. We want to lay out a process for inquiry and planned interventions for change, and then reflect on it with the community who might be using it. So in the end, we're hoping that we'll come up with some guidelines or suggestions that you can help us inform and refine. So we've got the 3 strands, which we're calling men's behavior change, fathering, and Aboriginal. Within each of those strands, we've got pretty much the same components. We're doing literature or document review. We're doing interviews with program workers, and then we're seeking input from men who are in programs and partners, as well as children of men who are violent. We're doing this in different ways in the different sectors. The literature review and document scoping reviews have been done for the men's behavior change and the fathering programs. I'll give you a little bit of an update on that. We're still finalizing the papers. We're in the middle of interviewing program workers from men's behavior change and fathering, and that's what I'm going to feed back a little bit on today. It's kind of like a work in progress, and the workshop this morning will help inform that, where I'll give you some of the feedback or some of the themes and ideas that are coming out, and ask you to feed into that for us. And then the children of men who are violent, that's part of the PhD project, which Katie will give us a little bit of an update on, and she started that work. The Aboriginal strand has had a little bit of a delay in getting started, so David is working on that project with Shawana, and David's only just come on board the last week, so he's very brand new, fresh, and we'll be starting that literature review with documentation and getting in touch with programs. So for any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander programs, you'll start to hear from us soon. Some of the outcomes from the men's behavior change literature and scoping review, just on this page, we found there were very few examples of men's behavior change programs that actually address men's fathering. Not that it's avoided, but that it's not an engaged component of the program, very few of them. Program evaluation has been very limited for most programs, so there's no evidence of practice. So there might be a lot of things going on, but we don't have strong evidence. It's not to say things aren't working, but we don't have the evidence available. The perspectives of children are largely not taken into account, or when there is just aspects of fathering within the relationship or the impact of violence on the children, it often doesn't necessarily incorporate the perspectives of children. So that's one of the research strands that we're focusing on. So it also highlights the possibility for programs to bring that into the components, that there is work being done on what children's voices and the perspectives of young people are that could be brought in. The most holistic approaches to look at it from all different angles tend to be the Indigenous programs, just on our beginning look, and we'll find out a lot more about that over the next 6 months. And there's issues, the issues for program manager interviews. When we've been conducting some of the interviews, we found it difficult to get information about what's in the content of the program. So for this project, we're trying to map the programs and what are programs doing, what sort of components, what do they cover when they're looking at the engagement with children. And everybody's a little bit protective of their program content, and we also want to impress that we're not evaluating programs per se, we're just trying to map what's in the state of play so that we are better informed about what's happening in the sector. Okay. With the fathering program literature and scoping, that's being developed into a conceptual framework where we're looking at the literature from domestic and family violence, child abuse and neglect, and parenting. And together, those 3 bodies of literature give great depth, and there's a lot of overlapping discussion about the impact of, say, violence, neglect, or different styles of parenting on children. and the common themes are emerging. So we're trying to develop that into a conceptual framework. And that's in very beginning stages, and that needs some testing. For example, men who use violence, in the literature, it talks about the parenting style being grounded in both attitudes and perceptual systems and in their patterns of behavior. And parenting by men who use violence cannot be viewed in isolation from their violence towards women, since it's informed by common attitudinal characteristics of entitlement. We look at the parenting literature. The discussions are around men who use violence display less warmth, less use of appropriate discipline, less positive parenting, less physical affection, less inductive reasoning. And from the child abuse and neglect literature, we hear a lot of discussion about the overlap between domestic violence and physical abuse, children being exposed to and involved in violence in a number of different ways. And at the most basic level, living with the abuse of the mother can be considered a form of emotional abuse when negative implications for children's emotional and mental health in future relationships. So we're bringing all those together and overlaying them and overlapping them to see how can we design a conceptual framework that could apply across multiple programs. So the implications for that is that we need to do further research and validate a framework once we've got that ready to test. And then, ask people, how do you think this will be valuable for your practice? For helping, we see it as maybe helping assessments. So being able to do some assessments in terms of parenting skill, engagement skill, that can be used, maybe components in fathering programs, domestic violence, men's behavior change programs, fathering programs, and across Indigenous programs as well. And then planning interventions, what that might mean. Okay. So that's the literature and document review that we've done so far, and how that's being processed. Where I'm up to with the program manager interviews, we're aiming to get about 50 interviews with men's behavior change, and 50 with fathering programs, and 15 with Aboriginal programs. So we're interviewing in all 3 states at the moment. And the aim, as I said before, is to provide a national map of the programs to identify the overlaps between the fathering and the men's behavior change program. So how are fathering programs dealing with violence when it occurs, and vice versa? How are men's behavior change programs dealing with fathering, or when they are aware that there are children in the relationship? What are the challenges that the program workers face in this arena? And what are the aspirations for work in this area? So this is what we want to report on: challenges and aspirations. Tools, methods, interventions being used. If there are evaluations, we'd like to know about them so that we can, showcase those or put them up for people to read about. We're looking at evidence of any evaluations. So that's sort of the end of the basic introduction of the overall Fathering Challenges project. Joni Smith is working on the interviews with the program managers at this stage, but she's also been involved with the SAFER research program. For those of you who might be familiar with that, we did a 5-year project reviewing the family violence reforms across Victoria, and Joni did her PhD in that ARC grant. Her focus was looking at men's behavior change programs and talking with both participants and the partner contact. So not couples per se, but women who were being part of partner contact, and the men who were in the program, and looking at them at different stages of time as they went through the program. She had a fantastic PhD that was passed last year, and she's going to talk now in particular about some of the research, some of the content that came out of that from the perspectives of the participants and their views about child protection and the men's behavior change program intersections.
Thanks, everyone. This is my first presentation as a doctor. So it feels pretty good. I can tell you, it feels pretty good. You will reach me on that email address, but only if you spell Monash correctly. Anyway, thanks for being here. It's great to see so many people. Some of you I will have spoken to on the phone. Some of you I will be in touch in terms of in doing the interviews for the men's behaviour change programs and fathering programs. So my research was on consequences and accountability in men's behaviour change programs, and the experiences of that for men in the programs and for their partners. There was some pairing. It was a nested research project. Again, it was part of an ARC Linkage Grant most of you, is there people familiar with the Safer Project? Yes? No? Was part of the Safer Project, which was a school of research on the integrated family violence service system reform and how that changed the way we practice. Semi-structured interviews at 2 points of time, 10 couples. So I interviewed 20 men, 15 women. 10 of those were couples. I didn't interview them together. And 5 women who were still with their partners but not their partner. So there was a mix of men who were still with their partners, and I interviewed their partner as well. Women, obviously, who were the partners of those men. Men who had no partners, and women who had partners but whose partner didn't agree to participate. And one of the strengths of the project was that I was able to get the perspective of the men in the program and their partner on the same experiences and the contradictions and consistencies and inconsistencies in the experiences as they were told by the men and the women were very, very interesting. And triangulated with that, I interviewed a number of workers, and so 69 interviews in total. Almost all of there were a number of key themes that came out of it. One of the key themes that I'll talk about today, one of the key themes was about partner contact, and there's been some literature in the NTV journal about that. But one of the key themes that came out was around men's engagement with their children, and children being the hook that got men to come to the programs in the first place. Almost all of the men, 18 out of the 20 men, spoke with some remorse about their violence and its impact on their children. Now, how informed or how empathic that remorse was varied. Some men exhibited a much more responsive comments about their children. Some men talked about how bad it made them feel that their children felt bad. But comments like comments my son's face when I hit her. I knew it wasn't right. I didn't feel like a man. I never want him to look at me like that again. You know, those sorts of comments were quite common. Most participants demonstrated at least a limited understanding of the harm that the violence caused to their children from witnessing their father's violence. Although, again, there were a number of men, well, they don't see me like that, you know, which you would all be familiar with. And again, the responsibility that men took and the engagement that they took in acknowledging that impact varied, and it went from, a fairly astute understanding that, yes, this is damaging my child, to being angry that the children were scared of them. What are they scared of me for? Where men were able to acknowledge the impact of the violence on their children, they were more ready and more able to accept responsibility for that violence. So those men who had greater emotional knowledge and maturity were more likely to accept some responsibility. Yes, this is my fault, and it's my fault that I'm doing this, and it's my fault that my children are affected by it. I can still see his face. I don't want him to be scared of me like that. I don't want anyone to be scared of me. Some of the men, the interviews took place in Gippsland, which is 2 hours south, across 4 different programs. So some of the men were in a rolling program, some of the men were in fixed programs, and some of the men had come back 2 and 3 times to the program, and were doing it again. And all of those men were further along in the process. And obviously they'd come back a second time on a much more voluntary basis than they may have the first time. And it was interesting to hear at the 2 points of time when I interviewed men 3 months apart. And it was interesting to hear the difference in the way they spoke at times about their partners. There were some men who in the first interview referred to their partner as her or she or the mother. And then in the interview, the second time, were actually referring to their partners by name. You know, little steps, but indicative of a change in an attitude, I think, for some of them. So all but 4 of the men talked about how their children impacted on their motivation for change and about wanting to be a better parent. And that largely related to having developed a more specific and more sensitive understanding of their parental role. So coming to realise the importance of their role as a father with their children and the impact that had on their motivation to change. Things like, now when we argue, we make sure, and he actually said, well, we had one fight. Well, no, it was an argument since we reconciled. So even just understanding those sorts of differences. The first thing was, where are the kids? So an awareness of someone beyond themselves. And yes, it's a choice. I want to be better. I want to do this. And these were comments in relation to being a better parent. There was limited understanding of, even amongst the men who were the most emotionally sensitive to their children, there was still a very limited understanding of the impact of being violent towards the mother and seeing that as violence towards their children. I don't hit my children, I'm not violent to my children, it's only my partner. So not understanding that we know that violence against the partner, violence against mothers is violence against children. So there's very limited understanding of that amongst the men that I interviewed. Men's behaviour change programs, workers almost universally concurred with the impact of children on men in the group. And the sense that men felt a sense of shame that they weren't trusted with their own children. This is the men who were able to engage on the impact of their violence on their children. The interesting thing was that only half of the men who came that I interviewed had any child protection involvement, yet all of them were violent towards their partner. And if we say that violence towards their partner is violence towards their children, only half of them had any child protection involvement or any contact with child protection as an agency. And of those, the relationship with child protection was almost universally adversarial. It's us against them. And they would use that as a hook for their partners. If we don't stand together, child protection will take the children. So, in fact, rather than being a support for women, the men were using child protection as a weapon. They saw child protection as impersonal, as having power over them, that for a number of the men was infuriating, and that child protection used this power unjustly and unfairly. Now, I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying this is the perspective of the men in the program. And they used child protection to create alliances with their partner against services intervening. Where child protection was involved, the men saw them as an enemy, and an us and them approach. They came to the hospital, there was about 5 of them, and I was just sitting there holding my baby. And they've always been against me. They're all against me. Everybody's against me. Child protection's against me. 7 of the 10 men who came to men's behaviour change via child protection identified this consequence as the reason they stayed. So that's the positive side of that. So it may have been child protection compelling them to get there, but of the 7 of those 10, they saw that as why they stayed. So access and retention was an important factor of child protection being involved in the referral and in that process of men coming to the behaviour change program. But the adversarial nature of that created resistance. So then the workers in the programs had to overcome that to get the men to engage. So it's complex. And the men used child protection to obfuscate and deny and to minimise and reinforce constructions of victimisation, all those things men's behaviour change program workers will be familiar with. Now, some of that was facilitated by lengthy delays. You know, there were some men were told you have to do a parenting program and there's no parenting program that they can do, so then they can't access their children because they can't do a parenting program that they're compelled to do when there isn't one. So, you know, staff shortages, time delays, being involved with child protection and court cases sometimes for years, not getting any resolutions. It gave the men a sense of righteousness about their adversary relationship with child protection. And it impacted on the effectiveness of child protection as an accountability mechanism, you know. And there wasn't a lot of evidence, and I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but there wasn't a lot of evidence of a feedback loop between men's behaviour change programs and child protection, and certainly the men didn't see it. The men didn't experience it, or they didn't acknowledge that it was there. It wasn't something that they experienced or felt was a part of the accountability mechanisms across the integrated service delivery system. So I guess that one of the things that came from that was the need to make that cooperative relationship more visible and a more active part of what we do in men's behaviour change programs and within child protection and that relationship. Women didn't feel supported by child protection. The women in this study didn't feel supported by child protection in their efforts to protect their children and change their partner. Of the 10 women who were still with their partners, they were choosing to stay and they were wanting that relationship to continue. They wanted the violence to end, but they wanted the relationship to continue. However, child protection was also often a catalyst for them to leave, because if they weren't seen as protective, then they would take their children and leave. For some women, the risk of losing their children strengthened the resolve not to tolerate his violence. So it's a fraught thing. You know, there were women who didn't engage with services because they didn't feel supported by child protection, but then there were other women who the involvement of child protection was the catalyst to get them to be able to step out the door. But they universally didn't see child protection as an ally. And, you know, that's something that perhaps we need to, that we can strengthen. Because it created lost opportunities. There's lost opportunities in amongst that to create alliances with women who are faced with the possibility of losing their children. So protecting children, supporting women's efforts to keep their families intact. There were women who were trying to keep their families intact and free from violence, and weren't feeling that they were protected and that they were being supported in that process. The men felt victimised by inconsistent responses, lengthy delays in responses, repeated adjournments. The court system, repeated adjournments of court cases, exacerbated men's sense of being a victim and that the system is against me and nobody wants me to have my children, and what's the point of doing anything because it just gets adjourned. And it's used by men to strengthen their how they and their partner are in this together against child protection. Now I'm getting the wind up. So children and fatherhood are important concepts for men within the programs. They were a significant informal compulsion to attend the program. They're the hook that gets them in. They're the motivator that can keep them there. They're the carrot at the end. But protecting children and supporting women living with violence are a difficult concept which can be seen as mutually exclusive. And the contradictions and the tensions between the work of protecting children and supporting women is very difficult.
Hi there.
Hi.
Were any of the women and men brave enough to admit that they'd gone underground in continuing their relationship, but yet projecting to child protection that they weren't in a relationship so that their children weren't at risk of being removed?
None of the participants in my study were in that position. They were openly together. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Did any of them discuss having experienced child family violence as a child?
The men?
Yeah, men or
Yes.
the women?
Well, there are a number of the women who had gone from an abusive father to an abusive partner, and had lived with violence their whole lives. And there were a number of men who talked about. It was interesting because there was one fellow who was the most disengaged with everything. Nothing's my fault. It was just a hot day. I whacked my child. Really, what's the problem? And my parents did stuff like that to me, and it didn't do me any harm. So in lots of ways, his experience of parenting was one of the most abusive of the men, yet he said, "Oh, you can't blame that for everything." So, but yeah, there were a number of the men who talked about having that generational violence, yeah.
Joni, I'm wondering in your research whether you saw some examples of where the conflicts around protecting children and supporting women, where they actually weren't in conflict, where you saw some examples of good practice in that area?
Yep. Certainly there were examples of good practice. There were, and that's why I say the feedback loop between men's behaviour change programs and child protections wasn't evident to the men, and it wasn't evident in a lot of the interviews that I conducted, except when I talked to some of the workers, and the workers talked about their linkages with child protection and having that. So yes, there were examples of where that was really good practice, and one in particular, one young woman who was one of these women who had lived with violence her whole life. She'd been to the police on a number of occasions 10 years ago, and they'd come around and just sat down and had a bit of a chat with them all and had left. Because the other thing that was evident in that was the change in practice over time. That when she went to the police in the last 2-3 years, she got a much stronger response. The police came, they removed him. She had someone show up the next day to offer her support. So there was very good evidence of the change in the way that the integrated service system is delivering services in more recent years, which was really encouraging.
Hi, Joni.
Okay.
I just was very interested in the fact that you said that even the most enlightened of the men who you interviewed still had difficulty recognising that violence towards their children's mother was actually abuse towards the child. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that and what ideas you might have about how that link could be encouraged to be understood in a variety of systems. And secondly, I was wondering, you've talked a lot about child protection as a potential support for women. I just wondered if you could talk about other non-government services such as women's family violence services and the support they might have provided to women. Thank you.
Sure. Now, remind me the first part of the question?
Even the most enlightened men.
Yes. Even the men who felt remorse about their children, who could see the harm that it was doing, didn't associate the violence against their mothers, against their partners, as violence against their children. They saw them as completely separate. So they didn't or weren't willing to acknowledge that, I'm better with my kids. Like in second round interviews, I've got access to my children. I see my children now. The conflict only continues with my partner. So not recognising that ongoing conflict with the partner was ongoing abuse of the child. And in the way that they scapegoated child protection, not acknowledging that child protection, things are shit because child protection are in my life. Well, no acknowledgement that child protection were in their life, why child protection were in their life in the first place. And we were okay until child protection got involved, and they've just made things worse. So again, that was also around not recognising that child protection were there to protect their children from them and to support their partner. So whilst they might have acknowledged their violence towards their children, it was still around, there was still that ownership of their children and not being able to see the parent, their partner, not being able to give their partner the same they could look at their children with love and affection and, you know, my children are important and my children are valuable, you know, and I'm damaging them. Not being able to acknowledge that damaging their partner was damaging their children. So not recognising the harm they were doing to their partners was harm to their children. Got time for the second half? Other services, look, there was lots of stuff that came out about the involvement of other services. One of the significant things, however, is that women in men's behaviour change programs, we're not doing partner contact anywhere nearly as well as we could, and that is, you know, not through any lack of knowledge of how important it is or desire. It is simply about, you know, time and resources. One of the really important things that came out of the research was how important it is to support women and within that partner contact component, and that if we're not doing that properly, if we're not supporting women properly within the partner contact program of the men's behaviour change programs, we're not doing men's behaviour change. We're doing a support group. So this, in terms of the support for women, there were a couple of examples of women who got involved in the partner contact program, and from there were referred to a maternal child health nurse, got referred to a family violence counsellor, got referred to a personal counsellor, and got all these other supports put in place through that referral process because of the partner contact component. And they're the creative things that we can do, is get it, because you get the, you know, part of the assessment is that the men have to tell you who their partners are and give you their contact details, so we have access to them. It took me a long time to get the partners, and in fact the men would say to me, oh, you want to interview my partner? Yeah, you can interview, you know, and I would be getting the contact numbers for the partners from the men, not from the workers. You know, so I think one of the really creative ways we can do is to strengthen the partner component and to see partner contact as the primary work. If men's behaviour change programs are about protecting women and children, then I would argue the primary work of men's behaviour change programs is to work with the women, and the men are almost the partner contact component. I'll just leave you with that one.
Thank you, Joni. We're now going to hear from Katie Lamb, who's a PhD student on the current ARC Linkage project, and she's doing research from young people's perspectives.
Thanks, Kristen. As Kristen said, I'm a PhD student at the University of Melbourne, and my supervisors are Professors Kathy Humphreys and Kelsey Hegarty, who are both very apologetic that they're not here today. Just to give a bit of background about myself, I have a background in criminology and public policy, and I've been working in the Victorian Public Service for about 15 years with vulnerable families as a policy advisor and program manager. Just to introduce my research, as Kristen said, my research has two purposes. One, it's part of the larger ARC Fathering Challenges work, and the second is it's a standalone PhD research project. It's quite important in terms of the ARC work because it's the one opportunity for children and young people to have a say in that broader project. In terms of progress to date, I'm halfway through, so I'm 18 months into the 3-year project. I've undertaken quite a large amount of literature reviewing to date, and I'm due to commence my data collection in the next month, which is exciting because it's involved quite a lengthy ethics process to get to this point. Just to mention from the outset, in terms of definitions, when I use the term fathers, I'm referring to both biological and non-biological stepfathers and male partners of a child's mother. In terms of children and young people, I mostly use the term young people, but just to acknowledge that a proportion of the children that will be in my research will actually be children, so it spans both age groups. Just to start off, I thought it might be good to just outline the research questions for the project. So the research has 3 phases, and each phase of the research has its own question, and just go through these briefly. The first question is, for phase 1, what are the perspectives of young people on fathering in the context of family violence? The second phase is asking, what are the key messages young people who have experienced family violence have for fathers who attend a men's behavioural change program? And the third phase is going to be asking, what impact do young people's digital stories have on a men's behavioural change program and participants? And I'll go into each of these phases in a moment in more detail. So just to move on to have just a quick overview of the literature. In terms of the impact of family violence on children, I know this audience is probably fairly familiar with the bulk of that material, so I'll just run through it very quickly, but I want to spend a little more time talking about what children have said, what their perspectives are. So what we do know is that children have only fairly recently been acknowledged as significantly impacted by family violence. Before this time, they were considered witnesses. And research has now been undertaken to explore the effects on children of experiencing family violence on children's health, safety, learning, development and wellbeing. And what we know is children who experience family violence are at risk of a range of psychological and behavioural problems, and these vary by the age and developmental level of the child. A link has been found between family violence in the home during pregnancy and poorer birth outcomes, such as lower birth weight, higher rates of preterm labour, fetal distress and death. We know that young children have been found to demonstrate things such as delayed toilet training and development, as well as lower intellectual ability, cognitive function and verbal skills, while older children have been found to have higher rates of conduct disorder, lower educational attainment and higher rates of emotional problems. And adolescents have been found to be more likely to suffer from depression, display aggression and struggle to develop positive peer relationships. Moving on to talk about children's views. Historically, research exploring the effects on children of experiencing family violence was undertaken on rather than with children. However, this has changed somewhat since the introduction of the Convention on the Rights of the Child in the 1990s. Since that time, research has begun to acknowledge the importance of listening to children's views and experiences, not only in research but also in policy and practice too. So as a result of this change in thinking, a significant amount of research has been undertaken with children who have experienced family violence, and from this research we've gained a clearer understanding of children's experiences of violence, the impact of violence on all aspects of their lives, and their reflections on services and supports designed to assist them. In terms of the impact of family violence on children's lives, research suggests that children feel fear, both for themselves and their mother, with fear of their mother being killed quite common. Children talk about missing out on childhood and becoming responsible for their mother or siblings from a very young age, and children also express a generalised fear of men that doesn't seem to dissipate with time. A number of children across multiple studies express a sense of powerlessness and desperation, and they're very keen to find ways to help their mother and stop the violence, but not being able to find a way is described as a real frustration and stress for them. A particularly strong message came through the literature about the impact of experiencing family violence on children's schooling. Children report being unable to concentrate at school and as they're worried about what might be happening at home or about to happen at home. Children also talk about not wanting to go to school, wanting to stay home to protect their mother. They also talked about their aggressive behaviour at school, seeing them suspended. Stigma at school was also seen as a problem, and that was amongst both peers and teachers, who were both groups were described as showing a lack of awareness of their issues, such as why they might have patchy attendance, and these children also talked about bullying as a significant issue as well. In terms of services and supports, there's been quite a bit of research on this, and children who have experienced family violence often report feeling disappointed with services and supports, who they feel don't listen to them. Young people describe feeling like most services are designed for their mother and see them only as witnesses and not directly impacted, which they feel is a really inaccurate understanding of their experience. Children also talk about not being involved in decision-making by services, and this was not only in Australia but also across the UK and US as well. Group work was another theme that came out through the literature. Young people often talk about the benefit of group work and how much they liked it, as it allowed them to make friends with other young people with similar backgrounds and life experiences. And a good example of this is a recent Australian study which conducted a qualitative evaluation of an animal therapy group for a group of children aged 7 to 15 with experiences of both family violence and homelessness. This evaluation found that one of the significant benefits of the program was children's development of friendships and an improved ability to be able to connect with other people. And the author saw this as particularly significant given the tendency for children exposed to violence to have difficulty connecting and developing relationships. So it's probably important to note, as others have said, that the literature around the parenting practices of men who use violence is fairly thin. But we can piece together a bit of a picture about how men who use violence father from a couple of small studies we have, and these studies suggest that these fathers have a tendency towards authoritarian parenting. They smack their children more often, they get angry more often, they're less involved in their children's lives, both emotionally and with everyday tasks. Research also suggests that these fathers do take pride in their role of fathers. In one study, fathers described feeling proud that even though they use violence, they're less violent than their own father was. Several studies have consulted children who have experienced family violence about their relationship with their father, and these studies have found, as you would expect, children express fear, anger and sadness. However, this relationship is found to be quite complex, with variances according to age. And the relationship between children and their fathers have been found to be quite a source of confusion for this group of children. Many of the children describe missing their fathers after separation following violence, while another group of children express wanting to have no contact with their fathers at all. As Joni's touched on, little is known about whether fathers who use violence understand the impact of exposure to violence on their children. Qualitative studies suggest that these fathers often display a lack of awareness of prioritising children's needs or understanding children's point of view. Often fathers who use violence blame their young children for provoking them. Only a few studies have looked at the perceptions of fathers who use violence about the potential harm to their children, and these studies have had mixed results. While fathers generally do acknowledge their violence has some impact on their children, fathers rarely hold themselves solely responsible and often suggest that their partners have contributed to a negative family environment for their children. In addition, research with children about men's behavioural change programs for fathers is also quite limited, as you would expect. There have been 2 studies, and these have directly asked children about men's behavioural change programs and their experience of having a father in one. These studies found that children had a poor knowledge about what their father was learning. They hadn't been involved or engaged in the program in any way. They found that children considered the program as something to help their fathers and thought their mothers might be safer as a result, but they didn't feel safe for themselves knowing their father was in a program. When children were asked about what they wanted their fathers to learn in a men's behavioural change program, they suggested they wanted their fathers to talk about his problems, get help, change his behaviour so that they could spend more time together, and they hoped that after the program their father might be able to move back to the family home. So just moving on now to talk about my research study. As I said, it has 3 phases. The first phase is focus groups with young people. At the moment, we're doing the recruitment for those. So at the moment, we have 3 locations, Anglicare, Lilydale, Kildon and Shepparton, and looking at Mary Outreach, Brighter Futures in Broadmeadows. But we're still in the process of recruitment. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So what we're going to do is get groups of young people together. At the moment, we have ethical approval for young people aged 14 to 21. We're currently in negotiation about lowering that age limit due to one of the programs having a cohort of children that are younger, that are primary school aged. But that's still pending. So in terms of what are we going to ask the young people, we're going to talk about what makes a good father, how does a good father interact with his children and the mother of his children, what's the role of a father after divorce or separation. We're going to talk about frightening fathers, what impact do fathers' frightening or violent behaviour have on their children, what could a dad who has been frightening or abusive do to make his children trust him again. We're going to talk about when a father attends a program, how should children be engaged or involved. What are the key messages that fathers should hear about the impacts of their violence on children in those programs? And what changes in their father would a young person like to see after they'd attended a program? And how would young people decide whether a program had worked? And then we're going to conclude with a bit of a discussion about what sort of either father would you like to be yourself or would you like for your children? So that's phase 1. Phase 2, the second phase, we're going to take 10 young people from the focus groups and take them to the Australian Centre for the Moving Image in Fed Square, ACME. We're going to run a 2-day digital storytelling workshop where the young people will develop up a 2 to 3 minute digital story about the key messages they think fathers who use violence need to know when they attend a men's behavioural change program. So young people will be involved in developing the script, selecting the images, the sounds, the music, and with ACME staff it'll be edited and put together. So it's probably important for me to note too that that's quite an expensive process, the digital storytelling workshop, and we're really pleased to say that we've been offered funding for that component of the project from the Luke Batty Foundation. So just to acknowledge that support, which has been wonderful, both from Safe Steps and Rosie Batty herself have been facilitating that process. And then the third phase of this research will be trialling the insertion of a couple of those digital stories in a men's behavioural change program, and then making an assessment about whether it's something that we should look at doing more of, based on the perspectives of those who develop and deliver the programs, but also from the men, the participants themselves, to see whether it made a difference in their thinking. So in terms of the next steps, the focus groups are due to occur between May and July this year. The digital storytelling workshop is scheduled for the September school holidays, and the feasibility testing will occur later this year, hopefully. And the research is due for completion in October 2016. Just the only other thing I was going to mention is we are still recruiting for focus groups. So if anyone knows of organisations running group-based programs for young people who've experienced family violence who are in that age group, adolescent kind of age, would be very interested in hearing from anyone who might like to be involved. That's it.
Did the children get an opportunity to talk about how they felt the family violence had affected them specifically in their lives?
They will, yep. That'll be definitely one of the sort of discussions. The focus groups have kind of been phrased in an interesting way where we're not making children disclose. So the questions are broad enough to say, if a child was living in this sort of situation, how do you think they'd feel? Even though we do know that most of the children who will be attending have come from those backgrounds, we're going to allow them to speak in a little bit more of an abstract way. They can say, well, I know someone at school who, or I've got a cousin, or however they want to phrase it. So it's not going to be directly saying, what was your experience, but letting them speak a little more broadly. But yeah, that's definitely something we'll talk about.
Katie, just wondering, with the groups of children, are they, and young people, are they groups that have come together specifically for children and young people affected by family violence? Or are they drawn from a broader group of young people and children?
Ideally, we did set out to tap into existing groups that were based on discussing family violence for a number of reasons. For ethics reasons, that was a preferred course of action in terms of we knew the young people had already disclosed, talked about it, were comfortable, and they all already knew the other members of the group, so that we didn't have to recreate those sort of things. So that's where we've started. But we've actually found there aren't a heap of... It's interesting, for the age group we're looking at, we've been really surprised at how few group-based programs purely for family violence there are. So we've had to shift a little bit. So the groups that we've got they're all young people that are disadvantaged in some way or another, but it's not all family violence. But then the workers do say the majority of them have experienced family violence, but they're being brought together for a range of reasons. I know the Anglicare group is a boys group for young boys that have been part of a mentor program, so it's not specifically family violence, but there's a lot of it present in their backgrounds. Yep.
Have you had any consideration for children involved in group-based programs in post-separation programs? I'm from WA and we've got a program for children specifically after separation, and the majority of those children experience or have experienced violence and abuse, and then they're connected to supervised access. Are they a part of... or do I need to have a chat with you later about?
Yeah, they would be very welcome to be a part of this research, but it's not something that's come up. The focus groups have been established based on we have these meetings. This particular workshop is a little larger than normal, but we do have regular meetings with our stakeholder groups. That big list of organisations at the start that Kristen showed, and so that's where all the ideas for where to run the focus groups have come from. But we would certainly be welcome to exploring other avenues. Yep.
Now, Shawana Andrews is the Chief Investigator for the research for the Aboriginal and Indigenous Torres Strait Islander.
Hi again, everyone. I'm going to be really brief today because, as Kristen said, we've only employed David Gallant as our research fellow, whom started in that position last week, and we're absolutely thrilled to have you on board, David. But it's been a long journey over 12 months to try and fill this position, so we're somewhat behind the other streams. So we don't have any results or work to essentially formally present to you today. So I thought I'd quickly go through I guess the project and what we intend to do, and some of what we know about family violence in an Indigenous context. Actually, some of my slides might be a little bit repetitive because Kristen has presented some of this, but So we have a handful of partners umbrellaed by SNAIC, the Secretariat of National Aboriginal and Islander Childcare, and Victorian Aboriginal Childcare Agency fit under that, the Healing Foundation, Children's Protection Society, Relationships Australia, Victoria, and Nguala Willambong. And we have representatives from each of those organisations that come together to make up our advisory committee that will inform and guide us in terms of how we roll out this piece of research. We know that Aboriginal children are overrepresented in the child protection system, and currently there are 1,000 Aboriginal children in out-of-home care in Victoria. We know also that a majority of those children are in out-of-home care due to exposure to family violence. So this is the context within which we are undertaking this research, and our aim in that respect is to improve the parenting experience of Aboriginal children whose father figures, male role models, have used family violence. And in that respect, we are also taking a very broad approach to the notion of father. So we're looking at this through a cultural lens, and we'll be engaging Aboriginal men who might be uncles, might be grandparents, and other community members who take on a fathering role for Aboriginal children, both within and outside of the home. The outcomes that we're looking toward achieving through this research is some foundational knowledge about how and under what circumstances Aboriginal fathers and father figures who have engaged in family violence are parenting, to produce some practice standards and guidance for working with Aboriginal men who have engaged in family violence, to improve the parenting experience of Aboriginal children and the safety of women. So we're looking toward really having this as a building block toward some subsequent research, and to really engage at a grassroots level with Aboriginal programs and Aboriginal men. The research questions are: how do Aboriginal programs address the issue of fathering in the context of family violence within Australia? How and under what circumstances are Aboriginal fathers who use violence parenting? And what are the key fathering issues that need to be addressed within Aboriginal specific family violence, fathering or parenting or healing programs? We're taking a participatory research approach with this research, and using our workshops such as this one, and the one that we will have in November. We generally have 2 per year, and the members of our partners through our Aboriginal advisory group to guide this research, and to be very hands-on in terms of how we roll this out, and using an Aboriginal framework of ethical research. We're endeavouring to interview 15 or engage 15 Indigenous programs and interview the program coordinators or managers for those programs over the next 4 to 6 months. And we'll be using an Aboriginal specific lens that will be applied based on evidence from both the literature and cultural knowledge, which may not be represented within the literature. So we have some fantastic Aboriginal men on our advisory committee who have been working in this space for a very long time, and the cultural knowledge that they are willing to share is really quite amazing. So we're using both of those elements as the evidence base. The research will identify ways in which Aboriginal perspectives and knowledges are utilised in programs. We will explore the issues for Aboriginal men attending programs and identify successful interventions. The context of Aboriginal family violence and healing programs, through some of the literature and community engagement processes that we've already undertaken, We know that the approach is often holistic within Aboriginal specific programs. They aim to be comprehensive and they're consistent with Aboriginal worldviews. They often focus on traditional ways of being, contextualised by identity, connection, self-determination, with very much a focus on responsibility, for men to be taking responsibility for the violence. This research is being conducted in the context of significant lateral violence that exists within Aboriginal communities, which we know is a hangover from colonisation and which is an expression of powerlessness and oppression. So when you don't have the power to fight upwards, you can gain some power by using that over those who are next to you. This research will be culturally framed and trauma-informed at both an individual and a community level. So we know that the trauma experienced by Aboriginal communities is not only at the personal level, that it's at that community level. And we aim to really understand, and we know some of this, but to further understand and gain knowledge about what Aboriginal men value and what gives them strength and power and meaning. And so in an Aboriginal man's world, what is it, what wealth do they require? And obviously I'm not referring to monetary wealth. What do Aboriginal men to need to enable them to feel powerful and wealthy as an Aboriginal man within both Aboriginal community and mainstream community? So we're at the beginning of this project. We have a little way to catch up to the other streams, so we've had to adjust our timelines a little. David and myself have been talking a little bit about our timelines and yet to work out some of those, but certainly initially our aim is to undertake a community engagement process. So to start getting out into the community, looking at Aboriginal organisations that are running Aboriginal programs with a context of family violence, and speaking to communities about what they are offering their men in that respect. Identifying specific programs and working towards developing a relationship with them so that once we come to interviewing, we will already have a relationship with them. We'll be looking more deeply into the literature, and that will include community reports and documents and community-based literature and work that's being done that's not necessarily published. We will be convening our first official advisory committee meeting within the next month, identifying programs and coordinators to yarn with and working towards developing and refining our questions for our interviews, and then undertaking our yarns or our interviews with our program coordinators. So that's where we're at, right at the beginning. It's great to listen to where some of the other streams are at today, and hopefully at our next workshop we'll have some a bit more rich information to share with you all.
Sorry, look, I do a lot of work in Broome in the Kimberley, and one of the things that we know is that Aboriginal women are silenced not only by community, particularly if they're women on country from another country. How will you ameliorate some of the mechanisms and strategies that a whole range of structures use to silence Aboriginal women's stories of violence? At
At this stage, we're looking at interviewing program managers The next step will be to interview men. We would also like to interview women as part of this process. We're a little bit behind the 8 ball with our timing, so we're yet to, I guess, to really work through that and discuss that. But certainly that would be a part of the research that we want to do, and to engage the community and through that process to identify the best way. But certainly, provided we have the time, we would like to include that. Yeah.
I think just to add to that, because we've got supportive Aboriginal programs who are partners on this research, so that will help inform, the way that they're doing their work, and that will help inform sort of how this unfolds and access to the programs.
I'm from Snake. We have 3 young black eyes family violence programs. So, and I just wanted to also touch on the work that the Healing Foundation does. Yeah. I know that you'd be aware of that, but in terms of cultural healing and making people stronger, they've got some great literature out there.
And they're one of our partners.
Yeah.
Yeah, as is Snake.
I know that was fairly dense speaking at you and not a lot of speaking with you. I hope it helped to give you a frame for how we've gotten to the point where we are with this project. So having a lot of generation of, hearing from families who live with violence and the impact on their children, doing the research to get children's voices, and then trying to bring in the voices of the men in the programs and the programs.